Welcome back to this second video in our R80 restoration. This time I find out that it's going to take a lot more than fresh fuel and a charged battery to get a 43-year-old bike going again. We're going to look at our budget for the restoration, the diagnosis and prep works before attempting to start the bike, and what to look for in an oil change. Before we do that, here's a bit of relevant history to set the scene. Our story starts in 1918 when ABC, the All British Engine Company Limited, designed this boxer engine bike using advanced aviation technology with a duplex frame and rear swinging arm that was not commonplace until the 1940s. Despite being a great bike, ultimately high production costs made them uncompetitive with other manufacturers, and the design was sold to Sopwith, becoming the Sopwith ABC. Meanwhile, BMW's journey started out in 1923, producing an inherited longitudinal twin known as the Helios. Despite how open the engine is in the frame, an inherent flaw was overheating of the rear cylinder, something that today has to be managed in all longitudinal designs. The then BMW design director, Max Fritz, suggested that the best thing that could be done with the Helios would be to dump it in the nearest lake. BMW's short-term solution was to redesign the Helios, following the Sopwith ABC design, rotating the engine 90 degrees to have both pots projecting from the sides in the wind. But the BMW was more stylish and utilised a shaft rather than a chain drive. And so the first BMW badge boxer engine bike was born. Despite a challenge from the designer of the ABC, that company went into administration, and the rest, as they say, is history. 100 years later, a third of the bikes produced by BMW still utilise the flat twin engine that became known as the Boxer, because with both cylinders reaching top dead centre together is similar to sparring boxers. The only other pots in the wind manufacturer is the slightly more pert but less balanced Moto Guzzi. The R32 was a huge success, so BMW introduced overhead valves and other innovations in design for this boxer-engined R37. It had double the power at a heady 16 horsepower, and riders achieved over 80 road race wins in 1925 alone. And in 1939, Schorsch Meyer powered to a TT Seniors win on this 60 horsepower supercharged RS255 Boxer, achieving a record 100 mph average lap speed. Impressive stuff, as 84 years later, Peter Hickman set another record, piloting his 205 horsepower M1000RR to victory in the prestigious Isle of Man Senior TT, and both superstock racers, hitting an average lap speed of 136.358 mph. BMW's innovation and technology, developed throughout the evolution of the Boxer line, is applied today to even these latest superbikes. And now, from such heady heights and great DNA, we head back to our R80 resto. I did receive a comment below that it's all very well getting a great deal at auction, but what about the not inconsiderable costs of putting the bike back on the road? It's a reasonable point, and one we considered in carefully putting together the following budget. On the hammer we bid £1,900 for the bike, but to that you've got to add the auctioneer's fees of between 12.5% and 15%, and they're the responsibility of the buyer. And then you have quite a small window in which to collect the bike, so unless you have the time and a trailer or a van, then you'll have to rely on motorcycle transport. We did that and it cost £170, but the company moving motorcycles were absolutely fantastic throughout. Turning to what may need to be replaced, we anticipated starter and ignition issues and have allowed £220 for that. Engine gaskets and seals and those pesky pushrod seals, £60, that's mostly bits and all about the labour rather than the parts. Fueling and carb rebuild, we intend to sonically clean the carbs, but once dismantled of course you have to replace the seals and the O-rings, and fuel filters to add and potentially rebuild the petrol taps as well. Now the brakes rebuild is our most substantial budget cost. Clearly there's a big issue as the lever wouldn't move, and there's likely major issues with the master cylinder. This budget cost is based on rebuilding the master cylinder and replacing all the seals and brake lines. You could double this budget if you have to replace the master cylinder with a new pattern part, so fingers crossed on that one. Another large item is the likely re-chroming of the forks and subsequent rebuild. Then there's the tyres, tubes and rim tape, and I'm sure we could have a big debate on tyre choice, but currently we're working on Michelin Road Classics for that best combination of handling and look. Fluids, filters and service parts, £130. Body parts are things like replacement badges, I've allowed £90 for that. And then on improvements, I've presently allowed a modest £60 for anti-resonance rubbers for the cooling fins. But you could soon grow that budget with things like pulse jet ignition that I'd like to try given the mixed reviews. And you could also add a charging system and perhaps electronic ignition. But being something of a purist, I like the points and the opportunity to repair the bike at the roadside rather than have to rely on recovery if an electronic ignition component fails. All up this comes to £1,550, and with the purchase price it gives us a total of £4,000. Now I don't know about you, but I have faith that a bike in this condition, restored with original parts and with this low mileage, will be worth considerably more than that. Well, we'll have the chance to find that out at the end of the build, and then someone will come along probably and bobberise it. We've given the bike something of a clean-up, and it does already look a lot better. What happened here, the emblem, everything that is sort of plastic or glued is clearly perished, and so we've got to get new badges. What else have we found out? We lifted these rubbers on the stanchions and found that there's quite considerable corrosion in patches in the chrome. Unfortunately, it's right where the seals travel, so we've either got to get some exchange stanchions or get them re-chromed. We haven't made a decision yet as to which way we're going to go with that. Inevitably, we've got to rebuild these forks anyway, so another job to add to the list. I've also just done a cold drain. I've pulled the drain plug on the engine because I knew there was too much oil in it, and it's showing there's about 2.5 litres of oil was in the engine. It's not the cleanest, not the worst I've seen by any stretch of the imagination. It smells a bit fuely, so when the bike has been turned over in the past, I think some petrol it's been rich and it's washed into the oil. My first thought that the engine had been filled with preservative oil was rather wishful thinking, and we're starting to form a picture of the history of this bike. It was apparent that the oil was overfilled by about ½ litre, as the crankcase holds 2 litres normally. The oil also had a strong smell of stale petrol, and the petrol tank was also empty save for the dregs of old fuel in the bottom. What seems to have happened over the years is fuel migration. This is where the taps to the fuel tank have been left open, and over time, under gravity, the petrol has seeped past the float valve in the carb bowl and into the float chamber, and then seeped past the main jet needle, or the idle jet, and through to the intake. It can then seep past the piston rings and into the sump. This is more common than you might think, and the reason before fuel injection came along that vacuum petrol taps were introduced that only opened when required. This bike doesn't have those, and so it's important to close the taps after a ride. An upside to this situation is the condition of the fuel tank that has had little or no petrol left in it. What is important though is not to start the bike in this condition before doing an oil change, as the dilution of the oil affects its lubricating properties and could cause damage to the bearings, and the excess quantity would put pressure on gaskets and seals. This is why I'm doing a cold oil change, and after the bike is running we'll do a further oil and filter change. For the oil, although I did pull a spark plug out and find that the cylinder heads do seem to be oiled, so there'll be a bit of smoking when we start it up, but at least it will have preserved those cylinders. It's always a good idea when you drain the oil to catch it in a shallow drain, as I have, before putting it in to be measured, because then you can see what's in there. And to be honest, there are no visible metallic components at all. There's a little bit of what looked like just dirt or degraded seals. So that's really encouraging. So I've done a cold drain. Obviously, normally you would want to get the engine up to operating temperature to do an oil change, but we're not in a position to be able to do that because I wasn't going to start it or attempt to start it with A, excessive oil in the engine, or B, not knowing the provenance of the oil. So we're just going to drop it out. Also, next I'll show you how we change the oil filter and refill it with some iSynth 2050 or Castrol GTX, 2 litres, and then we should be in a position just to drain any residual fuel in the tank and flush it through with a bit of additional fuel. We have had a look at that and there's no rust in there at all, and then we should be in a position to crank it over without allowing fuel through the carbs, and we'll do that to get the oil pressure up on the engine before we then let some fuel through and attempt to give it a start. Next is the removal of the oil filter, which is this awkwardly placed cover down here with the 3 10mm bolts. You need a 1/4 inch drive with a flexi joint in it to get onto those. It's interesting, we'll see when we open this up that when you put the new one in, you've got to shim it correctly in order to ensure that the right clearance is there, so that the O-ring is crushed to the correct quantity. If it's not, it either gets cut or it allows, either way, it can allow oil flow back into the sump, and then the engine is starved of oil, and certainly don't want that to happen. So I'm just going to go in there. I haven't tried these, so I'm just going to go in there with my 1/4 inch drive and see whether we've got any hope of loosening these. Now this one's got a gasket in, but it's not always appropriate to have a gasket in. It depends. Once we get this off, I'll show you how we measure the depth to the inner casing, and that determines whether you need a gasket. The shims, you almost, on this model, you should always have a shim in place because it protects that O-ring from being cut, and that is not what you want. And they're just dropped out of there. That's the O-ring. It's quite flattened. There's a seal from the filter on there, which will be replaced. And then that's the shim that I was talking about. And the shim sits into this recess because on this design, the inner chamber is pressed in, and there's a very small gap between the engine casing and the inner cylinder. This means that if it's not sealed, oil can return to the sump, and when that happens, then potentially the engine can be starved of oil. So that's why we have the O-ring. That depth has to be right so that the O-ring is correctly crushed, and also the shim is there to protect the O-ring from being cut when it is compressed by the cover. And I can see that that O-ring is quite vulcanized there. And then want to get the filter out. You might need a hook for. There it is. Now that's a straight filter. You do also get them as a hinged filter, which particularly if you've got engine bars or fairings help. Now I can't see another O-ring on the end of that, so I've probably got to go digging for that in the back there, and I can see where it's sitting on the centre, just like it is on this one. One of the other things that you should do when you remove it is to take the cover off and fold out the pleated paper, because what that does is it allows you to examine where the filter has captured any metal particles, and by looking at those different metal particles you can actually determine where wear's taking place within the engine and deal with that in advance of any problems arising.
Reading your oil filter. This is not something your dealer will do for you when they service your bike.
The oil filter we removed has now fully drained, and I did suggest that it's good practice when you remove your oil filter, particularly as mileage increases on your bike, to open it up and spread out the paper filtration media inside. The reason we do that is to explore what deposits, if any, are inside that filter. That can tell you quite a lot about your condition of your engine, but they're not so easy to get inside of.
While he's doing that, the most common metal that shows up in the filter is aluminium, because it's the largest proportion in the engine, from crankcase, pistons to cylinder heads. It's hard and non-metallic. Small bits are quite normal during an engine braking period and are of no concern. If you found a quantity of aluminium filings, it could be a broken piston ring, and coarse salt-like fragments are from grinding and could be a loose valve guide or broken spring. Steel and iron show up as magnetic particles, and if backed up by a lab analysis, could be rusty cylinder walls from standing, where iron liners are installed and should clear. Iron filings could, though, be the beginning stages of cam failure. Gold flakes in a filter may be from the many bronze bushings throughout the engine, and if you find this, you'd want to drop the sump and examine the cause filter screen. Tin or lead is main bearing related and would be a sign of major danger in an engine past its run-in period. It's well worth changing the oil drain plug for a magnetic version, as this will capture any magnetic particles and is a great way to keep an eye on engine wear and keep those pesky particles away from bearing faces.
So now we've got the outer casing off, we can access the inner pleated piece. And these small silver flakes that there's like virtually, there's one there, one tiny one there. A bit of my glove. Nothing obviously on the inside face because the oil passes through from the outside to the inside, so you can just see those tiny little metal flakes there. But there's literally, I can count 1, 2, 3, and that's about it really, which is fantastic. Now this is clearly, I'd say, probably only the second oil filter that this bike's had installed. It would have had one when it was originally left the factory. It's done 8,000 miles, so I'm assuming that there is, I've got no service records after that, but obviously the bike's only done 7,900 miles, so you'd have expected at least one service after that. Okay, so the lip that I was talking about measuring is from the outer case to this inner liner, and then on this front edge you've got the lip, and I think you can just see there, if I light it up, you can see that there's actually is a gap between that cylinder and the outer casing of the engine, and that's the gap that you're looking to seal.
with the shim and the O-ring. So the O-ring needs to be crushed to the right amount, but not so that it gets split or cut. Right, so we'll put this new oil filter in. Now, to have any real accuracy, I have tried to measure this depth a number of times, and I get anywhere between sort of 3.3 and 3.5 millimeters, but I haven't got an accurate vernier depth gauge. I think we'll get one of those and check it when we next change it. It had a shim, O-ring and gasket and seemed to be obviously working perfectly fine before. With these sharp-edged lips, they all require a shim, and mostly, unless they're very deep, do require a gasket as well. So I'm going to put the gasket back in, the new gasket, but we'll do as we're only going to run this for a limited period of time before we do another change, then we'll do another accurate check then. So I'm just going to pop that filter in, make sure it seats. I've got a pack that came with this with all of the washers in, so you can see there's the gasket, the shim and the O-ring. So shim going in. And I'm putting the slightly smoother edge out. I'm just lubricating that O-ring with a bit of oil. And I'm going to drop that onto the housing, because that's the easiest way to do this, followed by the gasket, which sits around the outside there. Having got the cover on, you can just do up these bolts by feel, but otherwise they're only 10mm bolts. 8 Newton meters is plenty. I filled the bike with 2 litres of wonderful fresh 2050 engine oil, just over. The capacities are 2 litres when it's no filter change, and they say 2.25 litres with the filter change. The Bing pumper carbs on each side. I'm going to pop the float bowl off, and you do this just by moving this cover, and it should just pop off. They've probably been, I'm going to give it a tap with a rubber mallet just to loosen it. I have got a carb rebuild kit as well, because I think there's a good chance they're going to start to leak, but I just want to see inside. There it is, what the condition is. There it is. And actually, float bowls are remarkably clean. This bike certainly looks like it's only done the 7,900 miles that all the paperwork confirms it has. I'm satisfied they're dry. They're a little bit smelly from the old petrol, but we will be stripping them and doing an ultrasonic clean. But for our purposes right now, that's good enough. So now I'm going to just pull off these hoses, just here. So I'm going to pull the hoses off of the taps. There we go. So some fuel, probably can't see that, but some fuel is dribbling out. They'll put an inline filter in this hose, which when we replace the hoses we'll be doing as well. It's got twin taps, so I'm just going to do the other side. In there. Last job on my list is to pull the plug caps and get the plugs out and just have a look at what condition they're in. I know that it probably needs new HT leads for one thing. There we go. That's quite sooty, and I'll give it a clean up and we'll pop that back in. So this is the moment of truth. We've got to that stage where we've changed the oil, changed the filter, checked the plugs, cleaned out the tank and put fresh fuel in. We're just going to first see whether the battery survives. There's so many things could go wrong at this stage. So we have ignition, and you can see that the oil light is on here. So we're going to see if the battery will crank it over in order to get that oil pressure up. And we've got nothing. Okay, so take two. We've put another battery into the bike. It's not the one for the bike, but should crank all right. It is a BMW battery. So let's see, there we go. And we've got neutral light now. We've even got indicators going. There we go. So let's give it a go. I'll pull in the clutch. Still nothing. Sounds like the solenoid's starting. I think the starter motor's stuck. Starter motor's on top of the motor. I think it's just stuck. Okay.
Talking about the fire triangle at the end of the last video was clearly somewhat premature, as it's only relevant if you have a functioning combustion chamber, and for that you need crankage from the clearly failed starter motor. You also need a sealed chamber, and that means well seating intake and exhaust valves, a functioning head gasket, and piston rings that seal to the chamber. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We can check those things, but they're bound to be okay, right? Well, anyway, first things first, and in our next episode we'll dig out and diagnose the problem with the engine whirler. And, after the end of a long video outside YouTube time, Sally is ready to play.
Well, it's a wrap for this time, Sally, so give me a high five. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next episode, please like and subscribe below. Catch you next time.